December 26th, 1950, Seoul Airfield, before sunrise. The temperature is minus 20 degrees Celsius. The tarmac is dark. And somewhere to the north, maybe 40 miles, maybe less, the largest retreat in American military history is still happening. A transport plane touches down. One man steps off. He is 55 years old. He has never set foot in Korea before. He has no reinforcements with him, no new weapons, no new orders from Washington that will change anything on the ground. What he does have is a hand grenade strapped to his chest, the same one he wore jumping into Normandy 6 years ago. A jeep is waiting. He gets in. He doesn't drive toward Seoul. He doesn't drive toward a headquarters building, a warm briefing room, a situation map on a wall. He drives north, toward the front. His name is Matthew Ridgway, and in 6 weeks, without a single additional soldier, he will reverse the longest military retreat in American history and push the most powerful army on Earth back across the 38th parallel. Not because he inspired anyone, because he understood something everyone else had missed. Here is what the documentaries always get wrong. They show you the footage, the columns of soldiers moving south, the abandoned equipment, the officers who'd lost control of their units, the men who threw down their rifles and ran. And they tell you this was a crisis of morale, an army that broke under pressure, men who simply weren't tough enough for what they faced. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete. And the part that's missing is the part that actually explains what happened and what Ridgway did about it. The 8th Army in December 1950 did not collapse because the men lost their courage. It collapsed because the entire system had been built for the wrong war. The doctrine was wrong. The tactics were wrong. The command culture was wrong. The training was wrong.
And when the Chinese arrived, an enemy that fought in a completely different way from anything American soldiers had been prepared for, the system failed. The men didn't fail the system failed the men. That's a harder story to tell. It requires looking at decisions made not in November 1950, but in 1945, in 1947, in 1949. Decisions made in budget meetings and Pentagon offices by people who believed the next war would be fought with nuclear weapons, not with riflemen on frozen Korean hills. Ridgway understood this. He had 1 month to fix it. He didn't give a speech. He didn't issue an inspiring order of the day. He didn't appeal to pride or tradition or the memory of Normandy. He got in a jeep, drove to the front, and started asking questions. What he found was not cowardice. It was a system failure so complete that courage had become irrelevant. Here's what that actually looked like. Start with the numbers, because the numbers are the only way to understand how bad it actually was. 275 miles. That is how far the 8th Army retreated between late November and late December 1950. The longest retreat in the history of the United States military, a record that still stands today. It happened in 30 days. In November alone, the 8th Army suffered more than 11,000 casualties. The 2nd Infantry Division, fighting its way south through a narrow mountain valley called the Kunu-ri Gauntlet, lost 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a single day. One valley, 1 day. An entire regiment effectively destroyed. At the Chosin Reservoir on the Eastern Front, the 1st Marine Division fought its way out of encirclement by 6 Chinese divisions in temperatures of minus 30 degrees Celsius. The Marines made it. The Army units to their east, Task Force Faith, were largely annihilated. Equipment was abandoned on a scale that defies comprehension. Tanks, artillery pieces, entire supply depots.
Trucks with their engines still running, left on the side of roads because the drivers had simply walked away. The Chinese captured enough American equipment to display it in Beijing as trophies. Seoul fell on January 4, 1951, the capital of South Korea, the city the United States had already paid enormous casualties to liberate once, was abandoned for the second time in 6 months. By the time Ridgway landed, MacArthur had privately concluded the peninsula might have to be evacuated entirely. He told the Joint Chiefs in Washington that his forces faced annihilation. Evacuation plans were being drawn up for Pusan, the last port in the south, the place the whole war had started. Rumors spread through every unit. "We're leaving. The whole thing is being abandoned. We fought all this way and now we're going to sail home and the communists win." This was the scale of what Ridgway inherited, not a unit that needed encouragement, an army on the edge of total operational collapse. One cause. Everything traces back to one cause. The 8th Army that landed in Korea in 1950 was not a combat army. It was an occupation army that had been handed rifles and told to fight. Since 1945, American forces in Japan had been doing occupation duty, comfortable billets in Japanese cities, regular hours, limited field exercises, a peacetime rhythm that had lasted 5 years. And during those 5 years, the post-World War II drawdown had gutted every unit to the bone. Divisions that should have had 3 infantry regiments went to Korea with 2. Artillery battalions that should have had 3 firing batteries had 2. Tank companies that should have had medium tanks had light tanks, and in some cases, those light tanks hadn't fired their main guns in years. Regimental frontages in Korea averaged 10,000 yards. Doctrine called for 4,800 maximum. These were not abstract administrative problems. They meant that every unit in Korea was stretched beyond its design limits before the fighting even started. But the structural problem went deeper than numbers. The 8th Army had no doctrine for the war it was fighting. American tactical doctrine in 1950 was built around road mobility. Vehicles, artillery, supply convoys, the entire system assumed you would operate along roads and that your opponent would do the same. It was a doctrine designed for Western Europe, for the kind of war the Army had just won against Germany. 2 mechanized forces meeting on roads and in towns, with air superiority overhead and supply lines stretching back to friendly ports. Korea was not that war. Korea was mountains and ridgelines and valleys with one road at the bottom. And the Chinese, who had just spent 4 years fighting a civil war in terrain exactly like this, understood something that American doctrine did not. You do not fight on the roads. You fight above them. Here is what Chinese tactical doctrine looked like in November 1950 and why it destroyed the 8th Army. The Chinese moved at night, entirely at night. No vehicles, no artillery, infantry only, carrying everything they needed on their backs, moving through the mountains in total darkness, observing strict march discipline, no lights, no radio transmissions, no fires. American air reconnaissance flew during the day. It found nothing. Then, at night, the Chinese would be behind you. Not in front of you where your defenses were oriented, behind you, on the ridge line above your road, at the bridge you needed to cross, at the supply depot you were counting on. This is not a complicated tactic. It is ancient. But it requires 2 things that the 8th Army in 1950 could not match. Soldiers who can move cross-country in the dark, and commanders who don't need roads to function. The 8th Army had neither. When the Chinese cut the roads behind an American unit, the unit stopped. It couldn't move cross-country. It couldn't find the enemy in the dark. It couldn't call for artillery support effectively because nobody knew exactly where the Chinese were. It couldn't be resupplied because the supply convoys also needed the roads. And then the bugles started. The Chinese used bugles and whistles for tactical communication during night attacks, signals that had specific meanings for their own soldiers and that terrified anyone who heard them without knowing what they meant. The sound of bugles in the dark, from multiple directions, when you couldn't see anything, when your supply line was already cut, when the temperature was 20 below zero. This was what the Eighth Army faced in November 1950. Think of it this way. You have been trained to drive on highways your entire career. Every exercise, every manual, every plan assumes highways. Then, someone puts you in the mountains with no roads, no map, no GPS, and tells you to navigate in complete darkness against an opponent who grew up running these hills. Your opponent doesn't need to beat you in a fight. He just needs to get behind you. That's what happened at Kunu-ri. That's what happened at Chosin. Over and over again, the Chinese got above the roads, cut the supply lines, and waited for the cold and the darkness to do the rest. The Eighth Army wasn't outfought, it was outmaneuvered, by an opponent that understood the terrain and an army that didn't. Here is how a tactical problem becomes a psychological collapse, because this is the part that's hardest to understand from the outside. When a unit loses once, it learns. When it loses the same way twice, it becomes cautious. When it loses the same way 5 times, when every position it holds gets flanked, when every road it uses gets cut, when the enemy always seems to be behind it before it even knows the enemy is there, the unit stops making tactical decisions. It starts making survival decisions. Survival decisions are different from tactical decisions. A tactical decision says, this position is dangerous, but if I hold it, I can accomplish the mission. A survival decision says, every position is dangerous, so I should never be in a position. By December 1950, survival decisions had become the default mode of the Eighth Army. Units were filing reports on defensive positions they had already abandoned. Commanders were planning withdrawals before the enemy had even attacked. Officers who ordered their men to hold were being ignored, because holding had never worked and everyone knew it. Ridgway sat through one briefing at First Corps headquarters. One. He listened to the operations officer walk through defensive plans and contingencies. When it ended, Ridgway asked a single question. Where are your attack plans? The operations officer said he had none. Ridgway stared at him. I see, he said. Within days, that officer had been replaced. Ridgway then did something that officers throughout the Eighth Army later described as startling. He drove to the front, in an open Jeep, in the dark, in temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes, and asked soldiers directly, do you know why you're here? Do you know what you're supposed to do tonight? Most of them couldn't answer the first question. That was the deeper problem. And that was where he decided to start. Step back further. Because the failure in Korea didn't begin in November 1950. It began in 1945, and it ran through every level of the American military establishment. After World War II ended, the United States demobilized at a speed that would have seemed catastrophic to anyone thinking clearly about what would come next. In 1945, the U.S. Army had over 8 million soldiers. By July 1947, that number had fallen to 684,000, and it kept falling. Entire divisions were inactivated. Those that survived were stripped of personnel, equipment, and training time to meet budget targets. The assumption driving every decision was simple. The atomic bomb had made large-scale ground combat obsolete. The next war would be nuclear. You needed bombers and missiles, not infantry divisions. Ground forces were a legacy system, maintained for political reasons, not military ones. Korea proved that assumption wrong within 96 hours of the North Korean invasion. Task Force Smith, the first American unit committed to combat in Korea, 540 men sent to delay a North Korean armored advance, was routed in 7 hours of fighting. Not because the men were cowards, because they had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks.
because their training had been inadequate, because their equipment was aging and poorly maintained, because nobody had planned for a war like this. MacArthur compounded every structural weakness with command decisions that would have been considered reckless by any standard. He ran the war from Tokyo. He never spent a night in Korea. On October 15, 1950, he personally assured President Truman that no more than 50,000 Chinese troops could cross the Yalu River, and that if they tried, it would be the greatest slaughter in the history of mankind. By October 19th, more than 260,000 Chinese soldiers had already crossed. When early intelligence reports suggested massive Chinese forces were moving into Korea, his chief intelligence officer dismissed the first prisoners captured as stragglers. They were not stragglers. They were the advance elements of 11 armies. When the Chinese struck on November 25th, the 8th Army was extended 68 miles along a front with a 43-mile gap between its western component and 10th Corps on the east. There was no mutual support, no reserve, no contingency plan for Chinese intervention at scale. The structural failure, the intelligence failure, and the command failure combined to produce a situation where individual soldiers, no matter how capable, no matter how brave, had no system capable of supporting them. That was what Ridgway inherited. Not a broken army, a broken system wearing the uniform of an army. The difference matters, because fixing a broken army requires inspiration. Fixing a broken system requires diagnosis. Ridgway was a diagnostician. Here is what most accounts of the Ridgway story get wrong. They credit the turnaround to leadership, presence, willpower, the general who showed up and walked among the men. All of that is real, but it is not what actually fixed the 8th Army. What fixed the 8th Army was a series of specific, concrete, technical corrections to a system that had been failing in specific, concrete, technical ways. Correction 1. Objective. Ridgway changed what the Army was trying to do. MacArthur's mission had been terrain-oriented. Capture this town, hold this line, liberate this territory. Ridgway replaced it with a force-oriented mission. Find the enemy, fix him in position, and destroy him with firepower. The ground was irrelevant. The Chinese army was the target. Any terrain taken was incidental to killing Chinese soldiers. This sounds like a small change. It wasn't. It meant that every commander, at every level, now had a clear answer to the question, what am I supposed to do? The answer was always the same. Find the enemy and destroy him. Not hold this road. Not defend this ridge. Find the enemy and destroy him. Correction 2. Movement. Ridgway ordered units off the roads and onto the high ground. If the Chinese controlled the ridge lines, the Americans would contest the ridge lines. Not because it was comfortable, it was extraordinarily difficult, but because ceding the high ground to the enemy meant ceding every tactical advantage simultaneously. Units that had been ambushed repeatedly on valley roads now moved through the hills. They were slower. They were exhausted. But they were no longer being cut off from behind because they were no longer presenting the Chinese with the target they had been exploiting for 2 months. Correction 3. Fires. Ridgway made artillery the centerpiece of his operational approach. The Chinese attacked in mass infantry formations. They had no choice, given their limited logistical support for armor and artillery. Ridgway met mass infantry formations with coordinated artillery fires that turned those formations into mass casualty events. The Chinese casualties began to rise dramatically. Then they rose further. And then the Chinese attacks began to slow, because the tactical approach that had shattered the 8th Army in November was now producing catastrophic losses for the attackers. Correction 4. Command accountability. Ridgway told every corps and division commander the same thing. If you don't know where the enemy is, I will replace you. If you don't have attack plans, I will replace you. If your units are not sending out patrols, I will replace you. This was not a threat. It was a description of what he proceeded to do.
Officers who couldn't answer basic tactical questions were relieved, not reprimanded, not given a second chance, relieved, and replaced with officers who could. The Eighth Army had been an army where failure was managed and explained. Ridgway made it an army where failure had consequences. And then, only then, after the system had been corrected, he wrote, "Why we are here." The memo went to every soldier in the Eighth Army in late January 1951. It was not propaganda. Ridgway had no patience for hollow slogans, and his men would have recognized them instantly. "It is not a question of this or that Korean town or village," he wrote. "Real estate is, here, incidental. The real issues are whether the power of Western civilization, as God has permitted it to flower in our own beloved lands, shall defy and defeat communism." He told them they were not here by accident. He told them what they were defending. He told them, in plain, unambiguous language, why the fight was worth fighting. The letters spread through the army in 48 hours. On January 25, 1951, 30 days after Ridgway stepped off that plane at Seoul Airfield, the Eighth Army launched Operation Thunderbolt, moving north, attacking. For the first time since the Chinese intervention, American soldiers were advancing toward the enemy. By March 15th, Seoul was back. The capital that had fallen in January was liberated in March. By April, the front had stabilized at the 38th parallel, roughly where it stands today. Same men, same equipment, same frozen hills, a different system, a different result. The historian S.L.A. Marshall, who had spent more time with American combat units than almost any writer of the 20th century, later tried to put the Ridgway transformation into a single sentence. "No other performance by an individual," Marshall wrote, "compares with his feat of taking over the beaten and demoralized Eighth Army, Korea, late 1950, and transforming it into a confident, hard-driving, and unified force within less than 1 month." 1 month. The Eighth Army didn't need a savior. It needed someone to identify exactly what was broken and fix it. Systematically, without drama, one correction at a time. That is a harder job than inspiration. It is a less celebrated job, but it is the job that actually matters when an army is failing. Ridgway understood that, and he did it. Matthew Ridgway died on July 26, 1993, at age 98, at his home in Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The grenade he wore throughout his career is on display at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The 38th parallel is still there. 51 million people live in South Korea today because in December 1951, General understood that the problem wasn't morale, it was the system, and he fixed the system. If this changed how you think about what leadership actually requires, not inspiration, not charisma, but diagnosis, drop it in the comments. I read all of them. And if your father or grandfather served in Korea, if he was one of the men in that army in December 1950, I'd like to hear about it. Their war deserves to be understood correctly. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. There are a lot of them.